Hello, everybody. This is the map that I've been talking about. As you know, even though you can't see my face, I'm excited to show this to you. I've been talking about this for a while. If you'll remember, I haven't done a lot of videos lately. There have been two videos that I did over Christmas break 2022, which I encouraged everybody to just kind of stop watching all videos and just watch those two videos. One was called How Your Everyday Triggers Are Connected to Trauma and Repression. And the second one was How No Self and Authentic Self Are the Same Realization. So in those videos, I reference a map, and this is the map. So at that point, the map was just conceptualized as a guide to practice, 3 dimensions of spiritual practice, essentially awareness-based spiritual practice. But at that point in December, it was just conceptualized. Here, our own Toshi, who is a green checkmark facilitator. You can see our facilitators at killaby.com. Toshi is one of our green checkmark, which means he's certified in all of KI, including up to third dimension. So we put this together, he and I. He did the actual visual for this. He gets the credit for putting the visual together. So I want to explain this visual before I zoom in on particular dimensions. I want you just to look at the map as a whole. Now, remembering these 3 dimensions are dimensions of practice, but you could also say that within each dimension of practice, there are certain areas of unconsciousness which we may see in that dimension of practice. And the reason that helps us is it helps us to see that we may need a different practice, or to stop doing what we're doing, or to include something else with our current practice in order to not continue bypassing, basically, to not continue falling into these areas of unconsciousness. These areas of unconsciousness, you could say, really just are areas where we land for safety. So our nervous system seeks safety. Even though we and our minds might be concerned with freedom, enlightenment, freedom, whatever that is, our nervous system just wants us to stay safe. That's its only objective, really, survival and safety. To be trauma-informed is to include that understanding in any spiritual context. Okay, so being trauma-informed in that way, understanding that the system seeks safety, then we've illuminated the different ways in which the system seeks safety, and in a sense chooses safety in a way over freedom. It's not really like it's choosing safety, it's built for safety. So whenever we desire freedom, for example, our system instead might go to safety, which actually over time can look like bypassing, actually. You see, because we're looking, for example, to clear old grief, buried grief, but our system has programming that says, I don't want to feel that. That programming might be very unconscious. We've discovered in KI that programming that resists feeling emotions is really unconscious, actually. You are not aware of it, for example, in first and second dimension, usually. We became aware of it in third dimension. The programming that says, I don't want to feel this, and the continuous nature of that programming. Like when there's a feeling there, that programming is pretty continuous. When there's something uncomfortable, there's continuous programming. I don't want to feel this because it's not safe. Because I want to survive. The system, operates on the notion of survival. So if something feels unsafe, the survival mechanism kicks in, and the system then will go to safety. And so again, over time, this actually looks like bypassing in spirituality. But you can see that really it's just humans seeking safety. However, it's something that we have to contend with on the path. Otherwise, we will just continue seeking safety. And the problem with that is that then we're following the programs of our trauma, which we're seeking safety around all sorts of emotions and memories by not going there, essentially, by keeping certain things off limits that don't feel safe. We don't go there. And therefore, those issues remain. And those are the issues that science says turns into, or can turn into, well, that is trauma and emotional repression, unresolved, can turn into chronic pain, illness, both physical health issues and mental health issues. And also, we know that relationships suffer because of repression and trauma that's not resolved. I also know from just my practice that body contraction, so the tightness that you feel in your stomach or your chest, is trauma and repression, or your throat, that's trauma and repression. The content might be different for many of us, but it's basically trauma and repression. Okay, so back to our landing points. If you look at the red lines running through the middle, look at the very bottom of the red line where it says fear. So that's what that is. That's fear running through all of our dimensions of practice. So when we first come to spiritual practice that's awareness-based, we're going to be dealing with fear, because fear is what leads us to seek safety and therefore to bypass all the time. It's the fear of feeling this, the fear of feeling that. Hear that? That programming in us that we found in KI, the deep unconscious programming, I don't want to feel this, I'm afraid to feel that, is running the show as soon as we get here. It's actually running the show way before we get here, as you know. But to think that you're coming into an awareness, for example, teaching or meditation or something, and that by calming your mind or getting quiet or seeing that awareness is at the basis of your experience, that somehow that's going to uproot all that unconsciousness. Well, we've learned that that just doesn't happen. And so the places where we land for safety in first dimension of practice end up being the things that are just the source of our suffering. Let me show you. So we come here, think about it this way. This is before we even get to awareness-based teachings or practices. We contend with this stuff here on the left. I'm looking at the first dimension here, sorry guys, so you can see it well. Just looking at the first dimension. First of all, what makes it a first dimension? Look at the right, on the right. You'll see the thing that characterizes the first dimension of spiritual practice, other than the fact that it's an awareness-based practice. So if it's not awareness-based, if it's a therapy that is not awareness-based or something, it's not on the map. So people have been asking again, is this therapy or is this awakening? This is awakening, y'all. The fact that we're talking about the unconscious is what makes you think of it as therapy. Otherwise, there's really nothing about it that's like therapy, other than we're dealing with the issues that you might see in therapy. These are the same issues that we bypass, though, in spirituality. So we want to be careful, I think, with categorizing an awareness-based modality as therapy when it's not, because that might be just another way we bamboozle ourselves into not seeing this stuff here. And so this is awareness-based. So the first thing that must happen for anything or anyone to get on the map is that they have to be in an awareness-based teaching or practice, which means for first dimension, there's no prompting in that awareness-based teaching or practice. See that on the right? No prompting. If there's any prompting, which means if there's any inquiry that asks a question or prompts something up in awareness that wouldn't have otherwise arise, is that the right word? Would not have otherwise come up, say it that way. It's early. Sorry, guys. If we're not prompting anything up, then it's first dimension. So let's look on the right here, first dimension, resting as awareness. Wherever you hear that in non-dual teachings or meditations, that's a first dimension practice or teaching. So there's no prompting if you're just being pointed to that. or any of the non-dual teachings basically that are awareness pointing would fall in first dimension. Also, in KI, or the work that I've put out in the world, all of my 7 books are essentially first dimension, pointing to awareness. So if you're thinking there's a lack of that in KI, there's a lot of that in KI. First dimension pointing. My books are, well, probably 80% first dimension pointing in practice, like many non-dual teachings. Well, then there's about 20 or 30% of my books that have the unfindable inquiry or the living inquiries. This was before the Kiloby inquiries were developed. But so even the living inquiries were second dimension now, see. So still talking about first dimension here. And I want to mention that in KI, natural rest, where you just rest as awareness, or if you're familiar with the now process, make it stay, or metaphysical hands in KI, that's all first dimension. You're not prompting anything up. There's no inquiry there. You're just being with what is already arising. So this would include all meditation and really all mindfulness, because if you're not prompting anything up. And it includes self-inquiry where you're not prompting anything up. So if you're doing neti, although when you ask, who am I, that can prompt something up. So if you're actually asking that and prompting something up, it becomes second dimension. But if things are just naturally arising and you just simply ask, is that me? You're not really prompting anything new up. You're asking a question about what's already arising. So that neti falls in first dimension. It's important, I think, to categorize things where teachings and practices where you're not prompting anything up, so that we can then look on this left side. Well, actually, before we get to the left side, let me just show you the middle here, which is a lot of the left side. The things that we see when we first come to these awareness-based teachings and practices, before we learn second and third dimension, these are the same things that we see out in life. These are often the things that bring us into spiritual practice. Suffering, basically. So our suffering, what we've learned in KI, this is not anything new that we've learned, is that it's ego-based. But what we've seen directly in our bodies is that it's based in safety, actually. So when we shadow something out, see the red line shadows, we're doing that for safety, even though we don't understand it. It means that we've repressed a part of ourselves. And then by suppressing or repressing that, we shadow it out to someone else, so that if somebody else has that trait, we might either be negatively or positively triggered by it, as if we are drawn to it because we have that trait and we like that trait within ourselves, but we've suppressed it. So we're drawn to this positive shadow and that somebody else has that trait. Or a negative shadow where we are repulsed by the same trait that somebody else has, but we don't think we have it. That's the whole thing about shadows, that it's like, I don't feel like I have it, they have it. So what we're doing in our consciousness is we're splitting ourselves off. We have that. You spot it, you got it. Especially if there's energy around what you're looking out in the world. Trust when there's energy around it that there's shadow material. The energy that you feel in that shadow is your own energy. But you've repressed that energy, so it's stuck in the body. And it starts to come up in KI when you do shadow work. We start to actually lift and reverse the repression that creates the shadow when we get to third dimension work, see? But we can't really do that in first dimension work. Nobody can. Nobody can really do emotional repression or really deep trauma work in first dimension, because that programming is buried, somatically buried. So I didn't discover it until I got to third dimension spiritual practice. I didn't even discover it in second dimension, which I hope to explain in a second. But let's just go back to first dimension. Shadows, in a very basic sense, is how we're seeking safety. It's just safer. Think of it this way. It's just safer if I have a certain trait to deny it in myself. so I don't have to feel that. It's just safer than to shadow that out and make a point that they have it. That's safer than owning that and feeling and reversing that repression of emotion or other repression that's driving that shadow. I'm encouraging everyone, to the extent that you're involved in my work, to do shadow work. We have different ways of doing shadow work in the members area from the beginning of your spiritual practice. Because a lot of my job as a teacher has been through the years to go back and help people and help myself clean up and re-own shadows that are coming from repression and trauma. And it's a systemic issue in spirituality for people who don't do shadow work. This, I think, ends up being, for teachers, the shadows that they continue to carry end up being the source of some of the scandals, for example. But more than that, it's just everyday suffering with shadows. Okay, triggers. Again, we're seeking safety in the trigger, even though the trigger is painful. So we're not becoming triggered to be safe. That's not what we're doing. We're becoming triggered, but our system is already repressing a particular emotion or emotions. So for example, if I repress anger, when I'm triggered, likely what I'm seeing or feeling in the trigger is like an identity, like a deficiency story, right? Or identity of some sort. That identity has in it a repressed emotion or emotion. Because that identity that you see come up, like I'm not good enough, is not really what you are. You learned that. It's a script that you picked up. I'm not good enough. And that's going to be the source of many triggers in your adult life. So your triggers, many of them at first glance look like they come right from identity. Because that's what we see in first dimension, if we're lucky. See, because sometimes in first dimension practices and pointers, you don't even see the deficiency story. You feel it. So when you're triggered, you might feel wounded or hurt, but it takes some inquiry to see what is the story that you're believing, but you don't have inquiry in first dimension. So the story sometimes that's connected to that identity that's behind a trigger is unconscious in awareness. I'll talk to you about how in second dimension, we start to make that more conscious. But in first dimension, sometimes, and there's actually research behind this, guys, this is why I've changed my message. The research says that in our everyday triggers, the trauma and repression is driving it. But the trauma does not arise in the trigger as a memory or as programming. In other words, the story, just like I said, the mind part of the identity often stays unconscious in a trigger so that all you feel is the reaction and the focusing on the other person. And that's how you stay safe, in the sense by focusing on the other person, that in of itself keeps you from having to feel directly down into your body. But once you see the identity that's there, if you see it, frankly, if you're lucky enough to see it, because again, it doesn't arise in the moment of being triggered. The dad programming, for example, that's behind the trigger doesn't arise naturally in awareness, first dimension. So again, if you're lucky, you can rest and allow the effects of that, whatever does show up, the triggers, in awareness, just allowing it to be as it is. Now, we're seeking safety in those triggers simply for this reason. There's repressed emotion in the trigger. So if our primary repression is anger, if we're triggered, we're going to show up as hurt. There might be anger repressed in it, for example, but it's not acknowledged, fully felt, truly transmuted if it's repressed. So there's going to be that repressed emotion in our triggers. And so that the emotions that do show up in the trigger are going to be safer than that repressed emotion. This is so important to hear, because this is the source of, in my view, most of the bypassing in spirituality here, especially non-duality, happens right here. When people don't see that a particular identity that comes up, if they're lucky enough to see it in first dimension, because again, it hides. Because what you see is just you feel triggered sometimes, but you don't know what the identity is, right? But what I'm saying is, even once you discover the identity, which I'm going to talk about in the second dimension more, when you really make it conscious, the thing that we discover is there's still a repression in it. If there's a separate self-identity trigger, there's still repression and trauma in that. That's why that particular identity is coming out, because as a child, you developed into that identity because you had to repress certain emotions. Those emotions are still repressed. So when the trigger happens in adult life, that identity comes back, but the trigger, the repressed emotion is also there. So you don't, when you're triggered into your separate self-identity, unless you're doing emotional repression work, that repression, that emotion remains repressed. You don't even get to it really at all when you're investigating separate self. So we'll talk about that more in just a second here. Okay, so let's just move down the list here. Let's look at chronic pain in first dimension. This is something that you might be aware of when you first come, or body contraction, but you wouldn't necessarily be aware at all that it's anger, repression, or trauma if it is, because the repression or trauma is not going to arise into awareness. You're just going to feel pain, or like your stomach's going to feel tight. But still, again, it's being produced from the trauma and repression that's hidden in the body. You're just going to see the effects, and that's the chronic pain, or body contraction, or triggers, or shadows. And frankly, even chronic pain, if there's emotional repression to the system, it feels safer to have that pain until the pain gets bad enough than it does to reverse the emotional repression and the pain. So there again is safety. This is why people have pain for many years, and they have trouble healing it, because to heal it would be to go to the emotional repression, the very thing that they're avoiding, like me with anger repression. Major bypass can come in with body contractions and chronic pain for that reason. So body contractions, all that is, what I mean is tight throat, closed heart, tight stomach, or contraction. That's emotional repression trauma, but you don't see the trauma or repression programming in first dimension. You're just going to notice body contraction. That is if you're lucky, because there's so much mind programming going on for us when we first get here that often we have difficulty coming down and feeling into the body. So that's more second and third dimension, actually, embodiment work. But we will see some things. We'll feel chronic pain, for example, or body contraction. Those are the visible, conscious landing points. See that? Those are the places where we simply land that we're aware of, that we become aware of in first dimension. We notice thoughts and thinking, attachments and detachments, sensations, again, pain, but we don't see the source of it often. Now, when we're in first dimension practice, we may start to read science and become more trauma informed and start to understand what's going on, but our practice might be lagging behind. If we continue in the same practice of not prompting anything up as we become trauma informed, there's like this disconnect here. We're starting to understand that there's stuff hidden in the body, but we can't see it in our first dimension practice. This is why I went into second and third dimension, is because I understood the limitation of first dimension pointing and practice. But first, there's great benefit in it. So there are people who are misunderstanding what I'm saying. When I'm saying move into second and third dimension, I'm not saying throw away first dimension. It's all included. It's all here now. So first dimension just simply means awareness as the basis of your experience. So you continue with that recognition of awareness as the basic foundation of your experience, your basic true nature throughout all the dimensions. Another aspect of the first dimension is allowing everything to be as it is. So throughout the day, when you're resting as awareness, you're allowing everything to be as it is, to the extent that you're aware of whatever's arising. Remember, because some things don't arise. But to the extent that things do arise to awareness throughout the day or in meditation, you're noticing and allowing and letting those things come and go. And that continues even as you get into second and third dimension practice, because at some point, something happens. The game changes. meaning it starts to feel natural. We're not practicing awareness. We are that. It starts to dawn on us in direct experience that awareness is our true nature somewhere in first or second dimension practice. We start to have that realization, which you could say is the no self realization or I'm awareness or whatever that is. That starts to sink in as our direct experience somewhere in first and second dimension practice. And we can even experience very deep states of realization, even in first dimension. We can have what looks like a complete non-dual recognition in first dimension, but often it just isn't embodied. It's very deceptive in that way. We just don't see what we can't see when we're in first dimension realization. If there's trauma and repression held in the body, we can't see it. So to the extent of what we can see, the nature of reality is non-dual. And it's a real seeing. And that's one of the great benefits of first dimension and second dimension practice is the non-dual recognition or the deep states of realization that can occur. But along with that, we've got a major bypassing problem, right? So let's go on with this. Well, we'll also see illness and health and depression, mental health issues in first dimension, but we wouldn't necessarily see the source of that. Again, trauma, repression. Okay, notice here that it says first dimension stuff, visible conscious landing, those are still safer than the things that I'm about ready to talk about. It's all relative, just safer than. So here we go into second dimension spiritual practice with the second dimension unconsciousness. So these areas where we're seeking safety in practice and still seeing unconsciousness, those are the areas where we are bypassing. So here you can see the fear that, again, runs through human life and all the practice. We might have dealt with some of the landing points, some of them, not all of them, in first dimension C. In other words, in first dimension practice, some of or many of our triggers may have just gone quiet, or our depression might have lifted, or if we did shadow work, less shadows. So we drag less of that in sometimes as we go deeper into second dimension practice. We're having maybe a deeper state of realization here. But the question is, in what way are we still playing it safe in second dimension practice? What is it, first of all, that makes a practice second dimension? It would be that here we are prompting things up with inquiry or some other prompt. So for example, first dimension practice, again, throughout the day is rest as awareness. You're not prompting anything up. You allow things to be as they are. But let's say in the middle of the day, some energy in the body feels stuck. And you come down and feel it, and you notice it's stuck, and you ask, or you say, what does this sensation mean about me? That's mining. See that listed on the practices and tools? That's a KI tool. What does this sensation mean about me? And then here comes mind that was hiding in the sensation. Remember, because the body keeps the score, the body has a lot of programming in it from trauma and repression, which includes identity. So when you prompt something up like that, a lot of times you're going to see identity stuff. I'm unlovable. I'm wrong. I'm not good enough. Again, identity that you didn't get to completely in the first dimension practice. That's one of the characteristics of second dimension practice, other than prompting something up, is that we tend to see more of the separate self-identity, frankly, because I think we're getting closer to the trauma and repression in the body. But mining, so if I say, what does this sensation mean about me? Here comes some thoughts to witness. Now I'm aware of the mind-body connection at a deeper level too, because as I prompt up the thoughts that are connected to that sensation, there's a strong connection between those thoughts and that energy. So that's good stuff to just sit and witness as I prompt that up. And again, here with KI, you might see identity thoughts coming up. So you just let them all be. And that takes you deeper into the seeing that you're not this identity that comes and goes. As you pull more of it up from the body, you're going to see deeper programming or older programming, but you're also going to see all of that comes and goes through awareness. for a deeper embodied recognition here in second dimension, and really starting to settle the question of identity in second dimension. But for many people, it will not be settled completely in second dimension because of the bypassing. So we're going to see a lot of deficiency stories. KI, reverse inquiry, utility inquiry, vulnerability inquiry that I do with you here in, for example, first and second dimension KI or second dimension KI. Those are all things that prompt something up. So for example, when I do reverse inquiry on I'm unlovable, an identity, if I say I'm lovable and I watch from awareness, here comes the material that's buried in the body, the thoughts come up, and I just rest and allow those. And something that characterizes first and second dimension seeing is horizontal. So as I prompt something up, I'm going to see things happen in a series, like one after the other. Like, I'm not good enough. Then that falls away, and something different arises, like, Dad never loved me. And then so horizontally, one after the other, just witnessing and allowing from awareness. Here, we're prompting things up, but still witnessing things one after another. That's the horizontal, one after another in awareness. Now, that's very helpful, but there's a great limitation to horizontal. Let me talk about horizontal in first dimension. See how it's still horizontal. We have it written there on the right. All that means is, again, first dimension, you're not prompting anything up. So what tends to arise are things one after the other. And you might say that none of those things are you. They all come and go, but they all happen in a horizontal fashion, one after the other. And say, but you're not prompting anything up. It's just whatever is arising. In second dimension, again, you're prompting things up, but still horizontally witnessing things one after the other. That's going to become really important in a second, in third dimension. Some other things that you might see, practices and tools in second dimension, outside of KI would be like Sedona method, Byron Katie's work, Hakomi, certain non-dual teachers who are very skillful at prompting things up with inquiry. You might become more interested in nervous system regulation and resilience techniques in second dimension because you're going deeper into the body. And you might need to stabilize with some techniques of just regulating the nervous system as you go deeper. There's a catch with that too, because we're seeking safety, excuse me. We're seeking safety with that too, with all of it. So with everything, there's like a benefit and a caveat with all of this. So as you learn nervous system regulation, your nervous system might become more regulated as you go deeper into the body with second dimension work. But again, with some of these regulation techniques, we might become somewhat dependent on them in a way that makes us stay too safe. And so there's a tension between regulating the nervous system with trauma and actually going into third dimension work, which transmutes and dissolves that. If we stay safe all the time, we don't go deep in. In other words, we're playing it too safe. I'll get to that in a second. I'm just listing the things on the left side here that you might see as part of second dimension. So within KI or my work, unfindability inquiries, living inquiries are also second dimension because we're prompting something up with those tools. Okay, and then the fear, the three lines in the middle, these are just, so we could see some of this even in second dimension. In other words, some of our triggers might remain in second dimension, some of our addictions, see that? We could carry them down where we're seeking safety in those ways. Our chronic pain could be carried on through second dimension and untouched by it. My chronic pain was untouched really by second dimension work. But some new landing places, you could say, can show up in second dimension, which feel kind of unusual to call them landing or even bypassing. But at a certain point in second dimension work, if we continue to explore just identity, that becomes just safer than, here it is, actually feeling the repressed, buried rage or grief or whatever that is in third dimension. See, so our focus on identity is helpful in the beginning, right from the beginning, but then becomes a place of just now we're just playing it safe. And we're really just exploring the effects of the repression and trauma. See, because the story or the identity comes from the trauma and repression for many of us. Childhood stuff, it's held deep in the body where the repression trauma is, that programming. So what we often see before we see the trauma and repression programming in third dimension is this identity, which is actually not as unconscious as the trauma and repression. So it's what I call low hanging fruit. Frankly, from a trauma informed perspective, it's not the core suffering. It's the identity that gets created from the core suffering, the trauma and repression. And so we want to explore the effects of that suffering, that separate self identity, but we don't want to stay in that in a way that avoids the trauma and repression of third dimension. And that's what a lot of people are doing. They're getting stuck in a way on either exploring self or on the insight that there is no self. So look at the second dimension list on the left. Non-dual insights actually can become a way to bypass trauma and repression at this dimension. So not only do separate self stories and identities become a bypass if we're just paying too much attention to that and not getting to the root of it, the trauma or the repression, but also if we're just paying attention to the insight of no self, that might be a way where we're landing for safety. And that way it's like defaulting on identity or the lack thereof as a way to, again, stay safe from getting into the really deep repressed emotions that are driving the identity. See that? You may not see it in your practice yet, because if you haven't done third dimension work, this might not make sense. But I really encourage you to do third dimension, because this is what we're seeing, is that the identity is like produced by the trauma and repression programming. It's not the core suffering. So the bypass is, I think, in treating it as the core and just staying there. You're going to see things like dissociation here. You know, when you get close to primary repression or something very buried, your system is going to default in a lot of different ways away from that. So it'll default into identity. Think about it this way. If you're in the middle of inquiry and you're about to open to the buried rage that you've repressed your whole life, it's simply safer to not do that and go to anger. If, for example, anger feels safer for you than that hurt or sadness that's repressed. See that? So you might default to safer emotions. You might default to identity. So when you're about to experience or feel and acknowledge buried anger, if that's your primary repression, then what might happen as soon as we get close to that is an identity comes up, like not good enough, as a way to kind of distract us. And it's safer than going to the buried rage. See, safer. So these are landing points for us on the path where we think we're going to the core suffering. We're often, at some point, we're just going to something that's just safer than actually going down deep into the body where the core is. Okay. I think that's enough for third dimension. Now, so third dimension is that's enough for second dimension. Third dimension is a relatively new dimension of practice. So the question is are there any other teachings or practices other than KI that are third dimension practices? I have put that feeler out. What is it that makes a third dimension practice first? It would be making conscious the mind-body connection around trauma and repression. So if in first or second dimension practice, you see in one setting, for example, a bunch of grief comes up, and let's say grief is your primary repression, that doesn't mean that you've seen and transmuted the mind-body connection around repressed grief. It just means some of it was released. Or let's say your primary repression is anger, and somewhere along the way of exploring anger comes up and seems to be transmuted. You can actually be bamboozled into thinking you've you've reversed the repression of rage or grief or whatever it is. But the repression is a habit of programming. It's not just an emotion that you're holding in your body, it's programming in your body that's unconscious, mind body programming that's holding on to that emotion. So you might release some of it in first and second dimension practice, but the programming is holding on to the rest. And that's going to be like frozen emotion in your body. So to the extent you're deep in non-dual practice and you still have contractions or chronic pain, for example, or you still have shadows or triggers or any of the stuff that we saw above, chances are that's because of your primary repression, which you're still avoiding. And there's a lot of bamboozling that goes on. We think that we've released this and that, but if we haven't seen the mind-body connection around it, the trauma, and I mean the mind-body connection around fleeing, fighting, freezing, holding back anger, not crying, not showing fear, those are all trauma responses. The programming around that is deeply held in the body. That will continue until it's made conscious, because that's what the research says. Trauma continues until it's specifically neutralized. So recognizing the global awareness doesn't specifically neutralize specific programming in the hidden in the body necessarily. And actually, global non-dual awareness can become a way to avoid going down in, as I said, in second dimension. So here, are there any other practices out there? I've not found them yet, but I do know that there are some healing modalities. Like when I look at Dr. Joe Dispenza, I don't know his modality, but to the extent that he's healing disease or there's some healing going on, I think that he's probably making some of this conscious. There are some other non-dual teachers that I think do stumble upon it, but it's a really difficult area to make conscious. So I'm leaving it out there because I would like to partner with other practices. So I'm not looking for people who work with repression or trauma. It's not what I'm looking for. There are people who definitely do that work. What I'm looking for are the practices that literally help us make conscious the mind-body connection around fight, freeze, flee, fawn, and all the repression. So I think it's actually a new dimension of practice, and there may be some others out there, but we know that we've discovered it in KI, making this stuff conscious. And this is what healed my chronic pain, because I finally got to the repression and the trauma. So really, look, here's your indicator of whether you want to go. If you came into awareness-based teachings or practices with any of this stuff in the middle, shadows, chronic pain, or even like mental health, contraction, triggers, addictions, and let's say you got into inquiry that's more body-based inquiry, and some of those things remain, you carried them into second dimension practice, and maybe even there's a few other landing points in your second dimension practice where you're still focused on identity. Put 2 and 2 together right now for yourself. You're missing something. So the answer will not be, obviously, if you've been exploring identity and you still have addictions or chronic pain or mental health, the issue you need to go deeper than where you're at, because you keep carrying this through the dimensions, see? So whatever you're carrying through the dimensions and not getting to is pointing you ultimately to third dimension practice. Because how else are you going to see it? Now, let's talk about this. How else are you going to see it? You're not going to see a lot of it in first dimension simply because the programming behind the depression, repression, trauma, all of that is deeply unconscious. So we're likely to carry a lot of this, some of us, in the second dimension practice. But here again, if we're not seeing this stuff in first dimension practice, we want to supplement that practice with second dimension, right? We're not throwing away first dimension awareness. That awareness is brought into second dimension practice, and we're already allowing everything just like in first dimension, but now we're prompting things up, and that's just going to go deeper. And by prompting some of this up, we may see then that some or all of these things do get put to rest. Like, for example, as we get to second dimension, maybe finally the depression lifts, or maybe an addiction falls away, or some shadows from shadow work are no longer there. But whatever we didn't get to is still carried into second dimension, along with these other potential safer unconscious landing points of identity and whatever else. So it's all showing us to go deeper. But if we don't understand where we're at on the map and where our unconsciousness remains and our unskillfulness, then this map will not be helpful. So let's just place ourselves on the map here. If you're in KI and you're doing third dimension, you're already including all of this. So there's not going to be a lot of bypassing if you've got the skill. And we now know that people who come in from first dimension teachings, one of the first things they want to do is go into second dimension and start exploring identity more deeply and some of the body stuff. But again, some of you will already be in second dimension practice. There'll be some of you who've been there for years, actually. And so here, again, look for any remaining from the red that's carried on. If you went into second dimension practice and you still have chronic pain, that's telling you something. And what I would say is if you've been exploring identity for a long time, that's not the answer to that chronic pain. In fact, the identity is a safe landing zone for chronic pain, because the chronic pain is really emotional repression and trauma. I mean, if it has an emotional root. So you can see how we get bamboozled into thinking, if I continue to just do what I'm doing, eventually it's all going to be resolved. But we're learning that this does not work that way. Just too many things are unconscious. There's too much seeking safety. And yeah, we're just blind to some of this. So first thing you want to do with this map, or when you come to KI, is where are you in your practice? Are you basically first dimension, second dimension? Chances are you're not third dimension yet, unless somewhere out there you found something. Find where you're at in practice. And this is what we're going to do with the members area, is when people come in, we're going to ask them questions about their practice and their recognition. We're going to put them in the dimension that helps them go deeper. So if they come into the members area and they've only been hanging around Scott Kilby books that have first dimension pointing before 2016, or just watching Eckhart or meditating, we're going to ask them questions and we're going to find out, do they need more of that? Or is that the issue, the limitation? Do they need to go into second dimension KI? In other words, are they just missing something in that first dimension? And most people are. So that's where we take them into second dimension for skillfulness and inquiry. And then they move eventually into third dimension, where we get into the trauma and repression that's creating it all. Now, let's say that somebody comes in and they've had plenty of experience, or they've had a shift into recognizing awareness as their true nature from being in first dimension teachings or practices, but also let's say they've spent a number of years in second dimension practice, doing Sedona method or Byron Katie or my previous inquiry. Here, we might start them in second dimension because they may not be aware of second dimension KI yet. So second dimension KI in some cases can be more skillful than other second dimension practices. It just depends. It's what works for you is what works for you. But what we want to say to you is that I would learn second dimension KI just in case there's something with that dimensional practice that you didn't get from other second dimensional practices. Because KI is actually much more somatic based than many of those modalities, even at the second dimension level. So we might not rush you into third dimension. What we might do is just make your second dimension practice much more skillful first, so that you're not just missing a bunch, and then take you into third dimension. See? And then some of you will come in, like if I were to come into the members area in 2017, I would have had no interest in this, because that's already my experience. Awareness is already here as my experience. And this would have been redundant. Anything in first dimension and it was redundant with regard to the chronic pain, for example. It didn't help, really. So I was also already had done second dimension KI, and it was great for so many things, but it didn't get to the repression. See, so if I were to come in as a student to KI in 2017, I wouldn't have gotten much out of this, and I'd already done a lot of this. So the only thing really left for me, in other words, I didn't have a lot of shadows. There was chronic pain, not a lot of triggers. Uh, a few addictions, but they were connected to the chronic pain. No depression, no discernible mental health thing. But I had the chronic pain, and I carried the chronic pain, see, into second dimension practice. I spent a number of years in second dimension practice. And again, it was very helpful. But in 2017, that is not what I needed. Because to continue to explore identity in second dimension would have been and was a bypass for me, because in that identity, if whatever that would have been, there would have been repressed anger, which was behind the chronic pain. So, and by the time I would have gotten here in 2017, if I were a student, I had already looked at identity. So this is a very interesting thing that happened to me with the chronic pain that I want to leave you with here. Is when I was doing third dimension work, healing the chronic pain, I didn't have a lot of identity here. Didn't have a lot of that. So that was peculiar in the sense that that landing didn't happen for me. There was a little bit there, but mainly it was just repression of anger. And so separate self identity exploration would not have been and was not helpful for me. It may still be for some people who come in, but it wouldn't have been helpful for me because there really wasn't anything showing up. This is why I mean that trauma and repression is more core suffering than identity, because identity mostly just vanished for me in terms of what people see or hear as identity, me, but the pain remained. And so the repression and trauma remained. And that's how I know that the repression and trauma is deeper and that the identity is more like low hanging fruit, because that had gone away for the most part for me, but the repression remained. And then when I started to do the work, so I did the third dimension work on my own, healed the pain, didn't find a lot of identity, some. Then I went back to help people in these other dimensions. And what I noticed here in second dimension and in first dimension is that when I would take people, get people close to the primary repression down here, whether it's anger or grief or fear, their systems would default into identity a lot, actually. So as soon as we get to close to the buried rage, victim comes up, or I'm not good enough, or I'm lovable. So I started to see that's a landing place that keeps us away from the repression, because I didn't have that in me. So that wasn't keeping me away from the repression work. But what it does is it distracts you away from the emotional repression and trauma by just identifying with I'm unlovable or whatever else. So a lot of my work was to help people see that their focus on identity can be way too overextended and actually become the source of bypassing. So a lot of what I'm doing with people between second and third dimension, excuse me, my alarm just went off. Second and third dimension is helping them see the bypassing in second dimension. Because there can be a sort of, and I'm going to leave you with this thought, when we get to deep states of realization, there can be a very, very strong bypass that comes in. Because again, for me, what's causing the bypass is the fear of feeling and expressing that primary repression. But the mind might couch the bypass in non-bypass terms and make it sound as if somebody's done. And that's self-protection is what I've seen. So we're having deep states of realization in first and second dimension, like they're actual realizations. And so when it dawns on you that there's no self, that's an actual realization. But the mind can come in and very subtly start to believe I'm done, and then therefore really just avoid whatever issues are remaining in the body, third dimension. And I think this is where our again, second dimension is where we're seeing The teachers, I think, that are getting sick, to the extent those are emotional issues unresolved, getting sick, getting chronic pain, scandals, but it's much bigger than the teachers. It's all of us. So this is the scandal, is how we're all missing this. And the teachers are just simply leading us, like I was like the blind leading the blind for a while around this deep unconsciousness. And maybe now you can see why I criticize teachings and practices, because look, if a teacher keeps pointing me to identity, or where there's no identity, and helping me miss the repression, that's something that we want to talk about, because these are our lives here, guys. A little criticism goes a long way in helping us discern what's going on for us. This is trauma. We should take this subject very seriously. If there's some criticism that needs to happen, then let that happen as part of the discernment to help you adjust your practice and potentially adjust your teachers, or come into some different understanding with other teachers around what's really going on for you, or other facilitators. I think that's all that I have on this. Let me just sit with it for a moment. Well, I do want to say this. What keeps people often in second dimension from going deeper is a fear, right? It's the red line. It's the fear. So the beautiful thing about third dimension practice is that it's safe. It's safer than any other thing that I've done around trauma repression. That's how I was able to heal my anger repression. If it would have felt totally unsafe, I wouldn't have healed that. So the modality that we created, that you hear me talk about, rapid fire, that's a safe way to go into your trauma and repression. If you do it unskillfully, it can be unsafe. But once you get the skill, it's safer. It feels much safer to then go into this stuff in third dimension. But if you don't have the skill, if you're still just dealing with first and second dimension pointers and practices or inquiries, of course you would be scared. Why wouldn't you? Because there's no practice in there that truly goes to the repression or trauma safely and effectively, like really safely and really effectively. You have every reason to be scared, because you don't have any modality that will help you navigate this third dimension. So part of what I'm doing on YouTube and other places is educating people to understand that we've created a modality that is much safer than anything before that I've produced, and that allows us to go into the trauma and repression and transmute that energy into life force energy or flow. That's what people are looking for. Ultimately, we're not just looking for I am awareness. We're looking for that flow, for where the awareness meets our human experience fully, and we're no longer holding ourselves back. And the energy is just flowing within us and in our relationships and in our life, our careers. That's what we're looking for. And I have to say that through the years, this is where that came about for me. Real flow came about through third dimension work, including healing. So I can't promise a healing, but true healing only happened for me here. Third dimension. Okay, guys, more to come, but I'm going to be focusing on the map with the members in the members area mostly. We have a lot of talking to do and some inquiry. I may or may not be on YouTube and other social media, but I wanted to introduce and give an overview of this map for those that are doing KI. You could obviously send your questions in, and I may do some YouTube videos for the general public, but I am going to focus mainly for a while in the members area, helping folks there that are, actually doing KI with me. Stay tuned, more to come.